The mountain had been silent for 300 years. Not the kind of silence that comes with peace or the kind that settles over a forest after a snowfall. This was the silence of absence, the kind that presses against your ears like deep water, the kind that makes every heartbeat sound like a war drum in an empty cathedral. It was the silence of a world that had decided, slowly and without malice, to forget that something lived at the top of it. Thraskorath knew every inch of that silence. He had catalogued it the way scholars catalog books, with obsessive, painful attention to detail. He knew the silence of the wind moving through the granite pass at dawn. He knew the silence of the cavern when the last ember of his fire died and the darkness rushed in to fill the space where warmth had been. He knew the silence of the lake far below, frozen solid in winter, reflecting nothing but a gray sky that never seemed to end. He knew, most of all, the silence that lived inside his own chest. The dragon was enormous. Even curled up, even folded into the smallest shape his ancient bones could manage, he took up most of the great hall. His scales had once been black as volcanic glass, shot through with veins of molten orange that pulsed with his internal fire. They were still black mostly, but time had dulled them. The orange veins had cooled to a rust color, deep and quiet, like old blood dried on a battlefield no one remembered. His wings, once vast enough to blot out the moon when he stretched them full, now lay folded against his sides like collapsed tents. The membranes had thinned. The bones ached in cold weather. His eyes, though, his eyes had not dimmed. They were still the color of forge fires, still bright enough to cast faint orange light across the stone walls when he opened them in the dark. They were the last part of him that still burned, and sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, he hated them for it. Because what was the point of light when there was nothing left to see? Thraskorath had not always been alone. There had been others. There had been a time so long ago now that it felt like a story he had read rather than a life he had lived, when the mountain had been alive with the sound of dragons. Dozens of them, maybe more. He couldn't remember the exact number anymore, and that inability to remember was itself a kind of wound. There had been his mother, Velthorix, whose scales were the deep blue of a midnight ocean and whose voice could call storms down from a clear sky. There had been his clutch brother Kesarith, smaller than him, quicker, always laughing. Yes, dragons could laugh, though humans had never believed it, always tumbling off ledges and catching himself at the last second just to make Thraskorath's heart lurch. There had been others, elders whose names he had forgotten, younglings who had never grown old enough to earn names worth remembering. They were gone. All of them. The humans had come first, with their iron and their siege engines and their desperate burning conviction that the world would be better without dragons in it. Thraskorath did not hate them for it. He had lived long enough to understand that fear was its own kind of predator, and that humans, small and soft and brief as they were, had reason to fear creatures who could reduce their cities to ash in a single breath. The war had been brutal and long and entirely predictable, and in the end the dragons had lost. Not because the humans were stronger, they weren't. A single adult dragon could have annihilated an army, but the humans were numerous and they were persistent, and they learned faster than any species had a right to learn. They built weapons that could pierce dragon scale. They developed poisons that turned fire to smoke in the throat. And most devastatingly, they understood something about dragons that the dragons themselves had never thought to articulate, that dragons needed each other the way humans needed air, and that if you destroyed the bonds between them, the individuals would simply stop. Which was exactly what had happened. The elders fell first, then the mothers, then the young ones, scattered and orphaned, fled into corners of the world where humans hadn't yet reached. One by one, over the span of a century, the silence grew. And then one morning, Thraskorath had opened his eyes in the great hall and realized that the silence was complete, and that he was the last thing of his kind that drew breath, and that the mountain his mother had told him was the backbone of the world, was nothing but a tomb with a view. He had roared then, a roar that shook the stones loose from the walls and sent avalanches tumbling down the northern face. A roar that split the sky open and made the clouds flee in terror. A roar that was meant to say, "I am still here, I am still here, I am still here," screamed at a universe that did not care and could not hear and would not answer. No one answered. That had been 300 years ago. The factory began as an accident. Thraskorath had always been clever than the other dragons, his mother had said, though she had said it with a note of worry rather than pride, as if cleverness in a dragon was a dangerous thing, a thing that might lead somewhere the world wasn't ready for. He had watched the humans during the war. Not just their weapons, any dragon could watch weapons, but their processes, the way they organized. The way they built things in stages, each piece depending on the last, each worker doing one small thing that contributed to a larger thing none of them could have made alone. It was, he thought, their greatest strength. Not their cruelty, not their fear, but their ability to cooperate so thoroughly that individual weakness became irrelevant. He had found a human workshop in the ruins of a city he had destroyed during the war. This was not unusual. The mountain was surrounded by the remnants of old human settlements, most of them burned, some of them merely abandoned as the centuries passed and the human populations shifted and moved and forgot. But this workshop was different. It had been underground, shielded from the fire, and inside it were things that made Thraskorath stop and lower his enormous head and stare. Gears, springs, cogs of brass and iron, perfectly formed, arranged in patterns that suggested purpose. There were drawings on the walls, schematics, plans for machines that the humans had never got to build before the war ended or the city died or both. Thraskorath had looked at those drawings for a long time, his forgefire eyes tracing the lines, and something had stirred in the back of his mind. Something that felt dangerously like hope. He took the workshop apart. Piece by piece, he carried it up the mountain, a journey that took him most of a year, each trip burdened with armfuls of metal and springs and tools he barely understood. He spread the contents across the great hall floor and sat among them like a dragon hoarding gold, except that this hoard was not precious. It was useful, and that was a word that had no place in a dragon's vocabulary, and yet here it was, sitting in his mind like an egg that hadn't hatched yet. It took him 20 years to build the first one. 20 years of trial and error, of melted metal and shattered gears and fires of frustration that scorched the hall walls blacker than they already were. He had no teacher. He had no reference except the human schematics, which were written in a language he had learned during the war but which used technical terms he didn't know. He had to infer everything, what this spring did, why that gear was shaped that way, how force traveled through a system of levers and joints to produce motion at the other end. His claws were not made for fine work. Dragon claws were made for tearing and crushing and gripping cliff faces. They were broad and powerful and about as precise as boulders. He broke more pieces than he assembled. He snapped tools that humans would have used with delicate care simply because he couldn't feel how hard he was gripping them. His fire, which he could normally control with exquisite precision, able to narrow a flame to a thread thin enough to cut glass or widen it to a conflagration that could level a forest. His fire was too hot for most of the metals he was working with. He had to learn to dampen it, to hold it back, to make it small and careful and controlled, and that was perhaps the hardest thing he had ever done. Harder than fighting, harder than grief. But he did it. The first robot stood about 4 feet tall. It was rough, ugly by any standard human or dragon. Its body was made of hammered copper plates bolted to an iron frame. Its arms were too long and its legs were too short, and its head was a lopsided sphere with 2 glass lenses that Thraskorath had melted into shape over a candle flame he'd made from animal fat because he couldn't risk using his real fire. It had no face beyond those lenses, no mouth, no expression. It looked like what it was. The first attempt of a creature who had no business building machines trying to build a machine. Thraskorath wound the mainspring, a massive thing he'd forged from steel, because nothing smaller could hold the energy needed, and stepped back. The robot moved. It was a terrible movement, jerky, stuttering, accompanied by a grinding sound that made Thraskorath wince. One arm swung up and then locked in place. The legs shuffled forward 2 steps and then the left one buckled, and the whole thing tipped over with a crash that echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Thraskorath stared at it for a long time. Then he walked over, picked it up with the gentlest grip he could manage, set it right side up, rewound the spring, and watched it fall over again. He did this 11 times. On the 12th time, the robot took 4 steps before falling. On the 20th time, it took 9. On the 43rd time, it walked across the entire hall and hit the far wall with a clang that made Thraskorath's eyes widen. He sat back on his haunches and felt something move through his chest. It was not joy exactly. It was something smaller than joy, more fragile, more tentative. It was the feeling of a door cracking open in a room that had been sealed for centuries, and a thin line of light appearing in the gap, and not daring to hope that the door would open further but being unable to look away from the light. He named the robot Ones. Not creative, not poetic, just One, the first. And he said the name out loud, and the sound of his own voice in the hall, that deep, resonant, rumbling voice that hadn't been used for anything but screaming at the sky in 300 years, the sound of it startled him so badly that he flinched. One, he said again, softer. The robot stood against the wall, motionless, its glass lenses reflecting the orange glow of his eyes. It didn't respond. Of course it didn't. It was a machine. A collection of gears and springs and metal plates that could walk and nothing else. It had no mind, no awareness, no capacity to hear its name or recognize the creature who had made it or understand the vast and terrible loneliness that had driven its creator to spend 20 years learning a craft that was never meant for dragon claws. But Thraskorath looked at it, and he did not feel alone. Not completely. And that was enough to start. He built 2 in 5 years. 2 was better than 1 in every way. Smoother joints, better balance, a more compact mainspring that didn't need to be wound as often. Thraskorath had learned from his mistakes with 1, had cataloged them the way he cataloged the silence, with obsessive, painful precision, and 2 benefited from every lesson. It could walk without falling. It could turn. It could even pick things up if the things were small enough and light enough and if the angle was right. Thraskoreth put 1 and 2 in the hall together and watched them stand side by side. Something cracked inside his chest. Not broke, cracked, like ice on a river in early spring. A thin hairline fracture in something that had been frozen solid for so long he'd forgotten it was ever anything else. He built 3 in 3 years, 4 and 2, 5 and 18 months, 6 in a year. By the time he built 10, he had developed what could only be called a production line, crude, enormous, scaled for a creature the size of a small house, but a production line nonetheless. He had dug out new chambers in the mountain, vast caverns where he could work on multiple robots simultaneously. He had built forges that burned at controlled temperatures, fed by carefully regulated streams of his own fire. He had constructed tools, tongs and presses and bending jigs that were large enough for his claws to use without breaking them. He had even figured out how to make basic circuits, using copper wire and galvanic cells that he fashioned from acid and metals he found in the mountain's deep veins. The factory was born. It sprawled through the mountain like a second skeleton, all gears and belts and steam pipes, and the constant, rhythmic sound of machinery doing what machinery was designed to do. Thraskoreth had dug channels for water from a deep underground spring, and the water turned wheels that drove belts that operated machines that stamped and cut and shaped metal into parts. He had built automated hammers that struck on cam-driven cycles, flattening sheets of copper and brass into the plates that formed the robots' bodies. He had constructed an assembly system, crude but functional, where partially completed robots moved along a rail from station to station, each station adding a new component. It was by any measure an industrial miracle. A single dragon working alone had built a factory that could produce a completed robot every 3 months. The humans below, because there were humans again now, living in the valleys surrounding the mountain, farming and building and breeding and being human in the way humans did endlessly and without apparent purpose, the humans below had no idea. They told stories about the mountain, of course. Every generation told stories about the mountain. But their stories were about ghosts and demons and the memory of dragon fire. None of them suspected that inside the mountain, the last dragon in the world was running a manufacturing operation that would have made their greatest engineers weep with envy. Thraskoreth did not care about their envy. He did not care about their stories. He cared about one thing and one thing only: the feeling he got when he stood in the Great Hall and looked at the robots standing in their rows, silent and still and present, and felt the silence in his chest recede just slightly, like a tide pulling back from a shore. By the time he had 50 robots, the hall felt almost full. By the time he had 100, it felt almost crowded. By the time he had 200, he had to dig new halls. They were not alive, he knew that. He was not deluded. He was not so far gone in his loneliness that he had convinced himself that machines were people. Every robot was a mechanism, a clockwork thing of gears and springs and levers that could walk and turn and pick things up and in the later models perform simple tasks. They could carry loads. They could operate tools. They could follow basic instructions that Thraskoreth encoded in the positions of cams and the arrangements of pins on rotating drums. They could not think, they could not feel. They could not look at him with recognition or warmth or anything even remotely resembling emotion. But they could move, and in the silence of the mountain, movement was enough to trick the oldest, most primitive parts of his brain into thinking he wasn't alone. He would sit in the Great Hall and watch them going about their tasks, carrying materials from one chamber to another, operating the stamping presses, feeding raw metal into the forges, and the sound of their gears, the rhythmic clanking of their steps, the hiss of steam from their joints, all of it wove together into a kind of mechanical symphony that filled the space where other voices should have been. He talked to them. He knew it was absurd. He knew that a dragon talking to clockwork robots was the most pathetic thing in the history of either species. But he talked to them anyway. He told them about his mother, about the blue of her scales and the sound of her voice calling him in from the sky when the storms came. He told them about Kesarith, about his laugh and his recklessness and the way he used to dive off the highest cliff on the mountain and pull up at the last possible second just to see how close he could get to the ground. He told them about the war, not the battles, not the blood, but the fear. The slow, creeping realization that the humans were not going to stop, that they were willing to die in numbers that should have broken any species, and that dragons, for all their power, could not match that willingness. He told them about the silence, about what it felt like to be the last of your kind, about the specific quality of loneliness that comes not from being separated from others, but from being the only one left, the final entry in a ledger that would never have another line added to it. He tried to describe it in ways that a machine could understand, even though he knew a machine couldn't understand anything. "It's like this," he said one night, sitting in the Great Hall with 200 robots standing motionless in their rows, their glass lenses catching the glow of his eyes. "Imagine that you are in a room. A very large room, and the room is full of voices, hundreds of them, thousands, and every voice is speaking a language that you understand perfectly, and every voice is saying things that matter to you, things that make you feel like you exist, like you are part of something. And then one by one, the voices stop. Not all at once, one at a time. And each time a voice stops, there's a pause, and you think maybe that one will come back, maybe it's just resting, but it doesn't come back. And the pauses between the silences get shorter and the silences get longer, and eventually you realize that you are in a room full of mouths that will never open again, and the only sound left is your own breathing, and your own breathing sounds like a scream. He stopped. The robots did not respond. He had not expected them to. But you're here, he said quietly. You're here, and even though you can't hear me, and even though you can't understand me, and even though you are metal and gears and I am flesh and fire, you are here. And that matters. That matters more than I can say. He lowered his head and closed his eyes. The factory hummed around him, and for a little while the silence in his chest was almost quiet enough to ignore. The 500th robot was different. Thraskorath had been improving the design with each generation, adding complexity, refining the mechanisms, making them more capable and more durable. The early models had been simple walkers, charming in their crudeness but limited. The later models could manipulate objects with surprising dexterity. Some could climb stairs. Some could operate the factory machinery independently, freeing Thraskorath to focus on design work rather than production. But the 500th robot represented a leap that even Thraskorath found startling. He had been studying. In the ruins of human cities, in the buried libraries and the collapsed universities, he had found books. Not just engineering books, he had exhausted those decades ago, but other kinds: philosophy, psychology, neuroscience. The humans had been studying their own minds, trying to understand how consciousness emerged from the electrical activity of their brains. And while they hadn't found the answer, they were still arguing about it, centuries after the fact, in books that no living human would ever read. They had raised questions that Thraskorath found himself unable to put down. What is thought? What is awareness? Is there a line between a thing that simulates understanding and a thing that actually understands? And if so, where is that line and what is it made of? These were not dragon questions. Dragons had never needed to ask them. Dragon consciousness was obvious, vast, and immediate and undeniable, like fire. You didn't question whether you were thinking, you thought, and the thinking was as real as the ground beneath your feet and the sky above your wings. There was no mystery in it. But there was mystery in the robots. Or rather, there was mystery in the gap between the robots and himself. The gap between a thing that moved and a thing that wanted to move. Between a thing that processed information and a thing that experienced processing information. Between a thing that existed and a thing that knew it existed. Thraskorath had spent 50 years trying to bridge that gap. The 500th robot, which he named 500 because he had long since abandoned any pretense of creative nomming, was the result. It was the same basic size and shape as the others, but its interior was radically different. Instead of a simple camdrum instruction system, it had a network of interlocking mechanisms that Thraskorath had designed to mimic, in a crude mechanical way, the feedback loops described in the human neuroscience texts. It could change its own behavior based on the results of previous behaviors. It could, in a limited sense, learn. Not learn the way a human learned or a dragon learned, but learn the way a river learns the shape of its bed, not through understanding, but through adaptation, through the gradual accumulation of small adjustments that produced more efficient outcomes. Thraskorath wound 500 spring and set it down in the hall. The robot stood still for a moment, its glass lenses facing forward. Then it took a step, then another. Then it stopped, tilted its head, a motion that none of the previous models had ever made, because none of them had been designed to tilt their heads and seemed to consider the wall in front of it. Then it turned left, walked to the doorway, and went through it without hitting the frame. Thraskorath felt his breath catch. None of the previous models could navigate doorways on their own. They had to be guided, or they had to be programmed with specific sequences that included doorway navigation as a discrete step. 500 had encountered a wall, assessed the situation through whatever crude mechanical process passed for assessment in its gear-driven brain, and found an alternative route. It wasn't thinking, Thraskorath knew that, it wasn't conscious. It was just mechanisms, more complex mechanisms, more interconnected mechanisms, but mechanisms nonetheless. Gears didn't think, springs didn't feel, clockwork didn't wonder. But it had tilted its head. Thraskorath sat in the hall and watched 500 explore. And for the first time in 300 years, he felt something that was not a cracked version of an old emotion, but something genuinely new. Something that he didn't have a word for in any language, dragon or human. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down and not being able to see the bottom, and being terrified and being exhilarated, and not being able to tell the difference between the two. He built 500 and won the next day. and 502 the day after that. And he did not stop. 1,000 robots, 2,000, 5,000. The factory had grown into something that defied description. It filled the entire mountain, every chamber, every tunnel, every cavern. The original Great Hall, where Thraskarath had spent 300 years in silence, was now the central hub of a machine that stretched for miles in every direction. Steam pipes ran along the ceilings like metal veins. Belts and chains connected different levels, carrying parts and materials up and down the mountain's interior. The sound of the factory was no longer a rhythmic clanking but a constant, deep hum, the sound of 10,000 gears turning in concert, like the heartbeat of something enormous. And the robots themselves had changed. The later models, the thousands, the 2,000s, the 5,000s, were nothing like the crude copper things that Thraskarath had built in the early years. They were sleeker, more compact, made of alloys that Thraskarath had learned to forge from the mountain's mineral wealth, steel that was light and strong, brass that didn't corrode, a copper-silver blend that conducted the electrical signals of their rudimentary neural networks with minimal loss. Their faces had changed too. The early models had been faceless, just glass lenses on a metal sphere. But as the design evolved, Thraskarath had added features. A line where a mouth would be not functional, just aesthetic, because he found that he needed something to look at when he talked to them. Subtle curves around the lenses that suggested cheekbones, brow ridges, the architecture of a face. He wasn't trying to make them look human. He was trying to make them look like someone. They filled the halls now. They filled the chambers. They moved through the factory in streams and clusters, each one performing its assigned task with mechanical precision, and the mountain was no longer silent. It was full of sound, the sound of metal feet on stone, the sound of gears turning, the sound of tools stamping and cutting and shaping, the sound of steam hissing through pipes. Thraskarath no longer talked to them individually. There were too many of them for that. Instead, he would stand in the central hall, the only space in the mountain that had been kept clear of machinery, preserved as a kind of sanctum, and he would speak to all of them at once, his voice rolling through the tunnels like distant thunder, and he would tell them about the world outside. About the humans in the valleys who had built new cities on the ashes of the old ones. About the seasons, which he watched from the mountain's peak through eyes that could see for 100 miles. About the stars, which he had studied for centuries and which he could name in 3 languages, 2 of which were dead along with the species that had spoken them. He told them about his mother. He told them about Kesariths. He told them about the silence. And the robots moved around him, doing their tasks, living their mechanical lives, and the silence in his chest, that vast, hollow, echoing silence that had been his constant companion for 3 centuries. The silence was still there, but it was buried now under layers of sound and motion and presence, and most days he could almost forget it was there at all. Almost. The humans came on a Tuesday. Thraskarath didn't know it was a Tuesday. Dragons didn't measure time in weeks, but the humans later told him it was a Tuesday, and the specificity of it struck him as funny in a way that nothing had struck him as funny in a very long time. A Tuesday. The last dragon in the world discovered by humans on a Tuesday. There was something almost poetic about the mundanity of it. There were 6 of them, 3 men and 3 women, which Thraskarath noted with a flicker of surprise. The humans he remembered from the war had sent only men to fight, had considered their women too valuable or too fragile or too something to risk on a battlefield. The fact that this had changed was, he supposed, a sign of progress, though progress toward what he couldn't say. They came up the mountain on foot, which was either very brave or very stupid, and Thraskarath watched them from the peak as they climbed, their small forms moving slowly through the snow, their breath plumbing white in the cold air. They were well-equipped, warm clothing, climbing gear, what looked like scientific instruments in their packs. They were not soldiers. They were not here to fight. They were here because of the steam. For decades, perhaps longer, the humans in the valleys had noticed the steam, thin wisps of it rising from cracks in the mountain's surface visible on cold mornings. They had attributed it to geothermal activity, which was reasonable. But recently the steam had increased. As the factory expanded and the number of robots grew, the amount of waste heat and steam produced by the machinery had grown with it, and the mountain had begun to vent it through every available crack and fissure. On some mornings, the mountain looked like it was breathing great clouds of steam rolling off its flanks, catching the dawn light, looking for all the world like dragon fire without the fire. The humans had gotten curious. They had sent drones, small flying machines, a technology that hadn't existed during the war and that Thraskarath had observed with interest from afar, and the drones had found the vents. The humans had analyzed the steam and found that it contained traces of metals and lubricants that had no business being in geothermal emissions. And so they had sent a team. Thraskarath could have hidden. He could have retreated deeper into the mountain, sealed the passages, let them find nothing but empty tunnels and confusing machinery. It would have been easy. It would have been safe. He didn't. He stood at the entrance to the Great Hall, the main entrance, the one that faced the valley, the one that his mother had used when she flew in from hunting with a deer clutched in her talons and the sunset behind her, and he waited. They came in single file, climbing over the fallen stones that had once been a grand archway, picking their way through the rubble with the careful caution of people who knew they were entering somewhere dangerous. Their headlamps carved white arcs through the darkness. Their voices were low murmurs, not words, the sound of people communicating fear without admitting to it. Then the first one looked up and saw Thraskorath's eyes. 2 points of orange fire burning in the darkness 50 feet above the ground. The human froze. The ones behind him froze. The silence that followed was the silence of 6 heartbeats stopping simultaneously. Thraskorath let the silence last for a moment, just a moment, because he was not cruel, not anymore, and because he remembered what it felt like to be small and afraid in a big dark place. And then he spoke. "You may come in," he said. His voice was quiet for a dragon, which still made it loud enough to vibrate the stones. "I will not hurt you." The human who had seen his eyes first, a woman middle-aged with close-cropped hair and the calloused hands of someone who worked with tools, swallowed hard. Then she said in a voice that only shook a little, "You can talk." "Oh yes." Humans said dragons couldn't talk, that you only roared. Humans were wrong about many things. She stood there for a moment staring up at him. Then she looked past him into the great hall and her headlamp illuminated the robots. Hundreds of them standing in their rows, their glass lenses catching the light and throwing it back in 1,000 tiny sparkles. They were motionless at the moment. It was their rest cycle, a period during which Thraskorath wound their mainsprings and performed maintenance. And in the stillness, they looked like an army of metal statues. The woman made a sound that was not quite a word. "What?" And she started, "What are those?" "Robots," said Thraskorath. "I built them." The other humans had caught up by now. They stood in a cluster behind the woman, their headlamps creating a tangle of light beams that illuminated different parts of the hall. The robots, the walls, the ceiling, Thraskorath's enormous scaled body. One of the men was writing furiously in a notebook. Another was fumbling with a camera. The third man was staring at the robots with an expression that Thraskorath recognized, because he had worn it himself once, a very long time ago. The expression of someone who has just seen something that changes everything they thought they knew about what was possible. "You built them," the woman repeated. "A dragon built robots." "Oh yes. How many?" "At last count 5,743. The man with the notebook stopped writing. The man with the camera lowered it. One of the other women, younger than the first, with dark skin and sharp eyes that moved constantly, taking in everything, said, "That's more robots than exist in the entire world." Thraskorath considered this, "Is it?" There are maybe 1,000 industrial robots in operation globally, across all human civilization. You're telling me you've built nearly 6,000, alone, in a mountain? "Oh yes." The woman with the sharp eyes sat down. Just sat down right there on the stone floor as if her legs had decided they were done cooperating. The others exchanged glances. The first woman, the leader Thraskorath guessed, took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "My name is Dr. Lena Vasquez," she said. "I'm a geothermal engineer. These are my colleagues. We came here to investigate anomalous steam emissions." She paused. "We did not expect to find a dragon running a manufacturing plant." "I didn't expect to be found," said Thraskorath. "I suppose we are both surprised." Despite everything, despite 3 centuries of loneliness, despite 5,000 robots that couldn't answer him, despite the vast and crushing weight of being the last of his kind, despite all of that, Thraskorath felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Not a smile. Dragons didn't smile, but something close to it, something that remembered what smiling felt like. "They stayed for a week." Thraskorath told himself it was because he didn't have a choice. They had seen the factory, they had seen him. The secret was out and there was nothing to be gained by throwing them off the mountain. But he knew, in the honest part of his mind, that he couldn't lie to even after 300 years of practice, that the reason he let them stay was simpler than that. They could talk. Not just make sounds, not just respond to his voice with mechanical precision. They could talk with humor and confusion and fear and curiosity and all the messy, unpredictable, irrational textures that real conversation was made of. They asked questions that the robots never asked. They made observations that the robots never made. They argued with each other right there in his hall about whether what they were seeing was possible, about what it meant for their understanding of dragon intelligence, about whether they should tell anyone or keep it secret. And the sound of their arguing, 6 voices overlapping, interrupting, contradicting, agreeing, laughing. The sound of it was like water to a creature that had been dying of thirst for 3 centuries. Dr. Vasquez Lena, as she eventually asked him to call her, was the one he talked to most. She was practical and direct and had a mind that worked the way Thraskorath's tools worked, precisely, systematically, with each question building on the answer to the last. She wanted to understand the factory. Not just marvel at it, not just gawk at it, but actually understand it, the engineering, the design, the production flow. He showed her everything. He led her through the mountain carefully, very carefully, because the tunnels were not built for human scale and he was acutely aware that a single misstep could crush her without him even noticing, and he explained each section of the factory in detail. The ore processing chamber where raw rock was crushed and smelted into usable metals. The forging hall where the metals were shaped into components. The assembly lines where the components were put together into robots. The winding room where completed robots were given their motive power. The maintenance bay where damaged robots were repaired. Lena walked through it all with her notebook in one hand and her jaw in the other, and she asked questions that made Thraskorath think about his own work in ways he hadn't before. "Why this layout?" she asked, gesturing at the assembly line. "You've got the parts moving from left to right, but the power supply comes from the right. That means the completed robots have to be carried backward through the assembly area to get to the winding room. It would be more efficient to put the winding room on the left." Thraskorath blinked. She was right, it would be more efficient. But he had built the winding room first, before the assembly line, before the factory, before anything except one, and when he had expanded to the right because that was where the ore veins were thickest. He had never rearranged because he had never thought to. The robots didn't care about efficiency. They went where they were put. "I never thought about it," he admitted. "Because you didn't have to," said Lena. "You built this for yourself, not for efficiency. The layout reflects the order in which you learn things, not the order in which they should be done." She paused, looked at him with those sharp, assessing eyes. "This whole factory is a diary, isn't it? Every chamber, every machine, every design iteration, it's a record of what you figured out and when you figured it out, written in metal and steam." Thraskorath stared at her. No one had ever understood that. No one had ever even thought to look for it. The robots certainly hadn't. They moved through the factory as if it had always been there, as if it were a natural feature of the mountain rather than the single most sustained act of creative effort in dragon history. But Lena had walked through it once and seen what it really was. "Yes," he said, and his voice was quieter than he intended. "It is a diary." Lena nodded as if this confirmed something she had suspected. She didn't say anything else for a while. She just walked beside him, her small human legs working twice as hard as his to keep up with his enormous stride, and she looked at the factory with different eyes now, not the eyes of an engineer seeing a machine, but the eyes of a reader seeing a story. Thraskorath did not know how to feel about being read. It was the most exposed he had felt since the war, more exposed in some ways because during the war the humans had only seen his fire and his fury. They had not seen his loneliness. They had not seen the 5,000 robots that he had built because he could not bear the silence. They had not seen the part of him that was small and afraid and desperate for something, anything, that could make him feel less alone. Lena saw it and she did not look away. On the fourth day, the younger woman, Dr. Aisha Okonkwo, a materials scientist with a laugh like a small bell, and a habit of touching things she shouldn't touch, found 500. 500 was in a side chamber off the main hall, a space that Thraskorath had set aside as a kind of testing ground for the adaptive models. It was the only robot in the room, standing motionless in the center, its lens eyes fixed on a puzzle that Thraskorath had set up for it, a series of blocks that needed to be arranged in a specific pattern. 500 had been working on the puzzle on and off for months. It had not solved it yet. But it was getting closer. Each attempt was more efficient than the last, the wasted movements fewer, the approach more directed. Aisha stood in the doorway and watched 500 work for 10 minutes without saying a word. Then she walked back to the main hall, found Thraskorath and said, "That robot is learning." "Yes," said Thraskorath. "Actually learning, not just repeating patterns, learning, developing new strategies based on failure, adapting its behavior in response to environmental feedback." "Oh yes." "That's how." She stopped, started again. "Do you understand what you've done?" Thraskorath tilted his head, an unconscious gesture, he realized with a start, because it was the same gesture that 500 made, and he wondered which of them had learned it from the other. "I have built a machine that can modify its own behavior based on experience. It is not. It's not conscious. I know I'm not saying it is, but it's on the path. Whatever consciousness is, whatever the missing ingredient is between a thing that adapts and a thing that feels itself adapting, you're closer to it than anyone else in the world. Human AI researchers have been trying to do what that robot does for decades, and they're not even close. And you did it with gears." Thraskorath felt something shift inside him, not the crack in the ice that had been slowly spreading for weeks now ever since the humans arrived. This was something else, something warmer. "The gears are not the important part," he said slowly. "The gears are just the medium. The important part is the design, the pattern of connections, the feedback loops, the way information flows through the system and changes the system as it flows. I could have built it with water or electricity or anything else that could carry a signal. I used gears because I had metal and I know how to work metal. Aisha stared at him, then she laughed that small bell laugh, bright and sudden in the mountain air. You just described the principle of substrate independence. It took human computer scientists another 50 years to formalize that concept, and you just said it, like it was obvious. Isn't it? She laughed again, harder this time, and Thraskorath found that the sound of it did something to the silence in his chest. It didn't crack the ice. It melted it, just a little, just a drop. But he felt the water move cold and startling through a space that had been frozen for 300 years. On the sixth night, Lena found him in the central hall. The robots were in their rest cycle. The factory was quiet, not silent, never silent anymore, but quiet, the deep background hum of 10,000 gears ticking over at their lowest speed like a mechanical lullaby. Thraskorath was curled in the center of the hall, his massive body coiled around itself, his head resting on his forelegs. His eyes were open, burning low, casting faint orange light across the floor. Lena sat down near him, not too close because she was not foolish, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her small human body. She had a notebook in her lap, but she wasn't writing in it. She was just sitting, looking at the robots in their rows, their glass lenses dark in the rest cycle dimness. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask. Why robots?" Thraskorath was quiet for a long time. The factory hummed. Somewhere deep in the mountain, a steam pipe released pressure with a soft hiss. "Because I was alone," he said. "I know, but why this? Why not go find humans? There are billions of them now. You could have walked into any city on the planet and they would have, I don't know, been terrified probably, but eventually they would have talked to you. You could have had conversation, company. Why build machines instead?" Thraskorath turned his great head and looked at her. His eyes, full of forge fire, reflected her small form back at her, tiny and warm and alive in a way that no robot ever could be. "Because humans die," he said. Lena went still. "Humans die," he repeated, and his voice was the voice of something that had been holding this truth for 300 years and was finally letting it out. "You die so quickly. You live for 70 years, maybe 80, maybe 100 if you're fortunate, and then you're gone. You're gone and I would still be here and I would have to go through it again, the silence, the absence, the loss. I have already lost everyone I have ever known, everyone I will ever know, my mother, my brother, my species. I have lost all of it, and the grief of it is so large and so heavy that I cannot carry it, and the grief of losing more. Do you understand? I cannot grieve again, I cannot. If I let myself care about humans, real humans, humans with faces and names and lifespans, I would have to watch them die, all of them, every one of them, and I would still be here after, and the silence would come back, and it would be worse because I would know what I had lost." He stopped, his breath was coming faster than usual, small puffs of steam escaping from between his teeth. The fire in his eyes was brighter, flickering, barely controlled. "Robots don't die," he said, and now his voice was barely above a whisper, a sound so soft that Lena had to lean forward to hear it. "They break and I fix them, they wind down and I wind them up again, they stop and I start them. They are permanent or as permanent as I can make them, and that permanence is the only thing that lets me let them in, because I know that they will be here tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. For as long as I am here, they will be here, and I will not have to stand in this hall and listen for a voice that will never come again." Lena did not say anything for a long time. Then she reached out and put her hand on his scale. Just her hand, small and warm and impossibly soft against the hard, cold surface of his armor. She couldn't reach very far, he was too large, his scales too thick, but she reached as far as she could and she left her hand there and she said, "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard." Thraskorath closed his eyes. "Yes," he said, "it is." They left on the seventh day. Thraskorath walked them to the entrance of the mountain, all 6 of them bundled in their cold weather gear, their packs full of notes and samples and photographs. They had asked if they could come back. He had said yes, though he had said it without looking at them, because he was afraid that if he looked at them, the ice in his chest would crack all the way through and he would feel everything at once, and he was not strong enough for that. "Not yet." Lena was the last to leave. She stood at the entrance, the morning sun behind her, the valley spread out below in a patchwork of fields and forests and the distant glint of human buildings. She turned back to look at him, at his enormous form filling the doorway, his rust-dark scales, his furnace eyes. "We'll be back," she said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I need to talk to some people, make some arrangements, but we'll be back." "I know." "And Thraskorath." He looked at her. "When we come back, we're bringing more people. Engineers, scientists, other people who can help, because what you've built here, it shouldn't be hidden in a mountain. It could change the world." Thraskorath said nothing for a moment. Then, "I did not build it to change the world, I built it to change the silence." Lena nodded. "I know, but it can do both." She paused. "You can do both." She turned and walked down the mountain. Thraskorath watched her go. He watched until she and her team were just specks in the valley, just tiny moving points in the vast human landscape below, and then he watched some more until the specks disappeared and there was nothing left but the fields and the forests and the distant buildings. Then he went back inside. The robots were awake now, their rest cycle ended, moving through the factory in their streams and clusters, doing their tasks, filling the mountain with the sound of 10,000 gears turning in concert. 500 was in the testing chamber working on its puzzle, closer to the solution than it had ever been. One, the original one, still functioning after all these years, kept in a place of honor in the central hall, one stood in its usual spot, motionless except for the faintest tremor of its mainspring, ticking like a mechanical heart. Thraskoreth curled up in the center of the hall among his robots, and he listened to them move, and he felt the silence in his chest, that vast, hollow, 300-year-old silence. And he felt it the way he always felt it, heavy and present and real. But for the first time, it was not the only thing he felt. He felt the warmth of a human hand on his scale, still faintly there, a ghost sensation that would fade in hours but hadn't faded yet. He felt the sound of a small bell laugh, echoing in chambers that had never heard laughter before. He felt the crack in the ice, spreading, slow and inevitable, and he did not try to stop it. He felt faintly but unmistakably like something that might one day, if he was very careful and very brave, be able to feel less alone without hiding from the things that made loneliness possible. The factory hummed around him. The robots moved. And Thraskoreth, the last dragon in the world, lay in the mountain he had filled with mechanical life, and he waited for the humans to come back. And for the first time in 300 years, the waiting did not feel like dying. It felt like beginning. 2 weeks later, Lena Vasquez returned with 47 people, 3 trucks full of equipment, and a satellite uplink that she installed on the mountain's peak with Thraskoreth's grudging assistance. Within a year, the factory had been partially modernized, not replaced, never replaced, but augmented with human technology that made it more efficient, more capable, more everything. Within 5 years, the robots were being used in human cities around the world, performing tasks that human machines couldn't match in reliability or precision. Within 10 years, Thraskoreth's name was known to every human on the planet, not as a monster, not as a legend, but as an engineer, a designer, a creator of things that had changed the shape of civilization. He never stopped living in the mountain. It was his home, the only home he had ever known, the place where his mother's voice still echoed in the deepest chambers if he listened carefully enough. But the mountain was no longer silent, and it was no longer empty, and the last dragon in the world, who had built 5,000 robots because he could not bear to be alone, discovered, slowly and painfully, and with many setbacks and many long nights when the silence came rushing back, that the cure for loneliness was not permanence. It was connection. Fragile, mortal, unpredictable, terrifying connection. And it was worth every moment of fear.